Ladies and gentlemen, Mesdames et Messieurs, Saul Singer.
Well, thank you very much, Bob, Calvin, Chet, the Premier, the Mayor, and the honorees. I'm really, it's incredible to be even part of this program with these world-class honorees. It's so impressive, and that's part of what I want to talk about today. One reason, though, I'm so excited to be here is because Chet told me that the weather here is great. So that's why I came. You know, it's about 20 degrees and sunny in Jerusalem. So this is Tel Aviv. We call it the startup nation because Israel has more startups than anywhere outside of Silicon Valley. And this actually is a map of just some of the startups in Israel. If you go to something called mappedinisrael.com, you can see a live map of hundreds of startups. This is the Tel Aviv area. But this is what led us to think that there should be a book called Startup Nation, that this book needed to be written. And these startups are getting 2.5 times as much venture capital per capita as the United States. This is a very important vote of confidence from the investment community. You know, it's one thing to have lots of startups. A lot of them fail in Israel. A lot of startups fail everywhere. But question is, can you kind of compete in the world marketplace for investment? And so Israel is actually #1 in the world now in venture capital density. We're getting about 30 times as much venture capital per capita as Europe right now. And even just looking from Europe, one thing that amazed us when we looked into it is that even in absolute terms, not in per capita terms, Israel has been getting more venture capital euros from Europe than the big European countries. And research and development is one metric people look at. We're spending about 4.5% of our GDP on research and development. That's about double the OECD average, and again, very high in the world. So I want to talk about 3 things tonight. One is what makes Israel innovative. That's the main topic of the book. The other is what makes countries innovative. And of course, I want to talk about New Brunswick. And the third, and perhaps maybe most important thing, is how can we innovate together? So we have actually a misconception about innovation. And you can see this because if you put the word innovation into Google Images, you look for pictures of innovation, this is what you'll get, something like this. You'll get lots of light bulbs because the light bulb is the symbol of the idea. And we seem to think that innovation is about ideas. So that's innovation in our minds. But the problem is that that's not really true, or it's not really the essence. Ideas alone don't equal innovation. There are really a lot of great ideas. I don't think that there are more great ideas in Israel than anywhere else. There are a lot of great ideas everywhere. The question, though, is what you add to the ideas to make them into companies, into startups, into innovation, into actual products and things that people use and change people's lives. The other misconception that people have is that innovation is about technology. Technology and innovation are not the same thing. We sometimes forget that in Israel because we're very strong in technology. There's so much you have to add to technology to make innovation. And I want to talk about the 2 things that you have to add to ideas and technology to get actual innovation. The first is, a great word for it is grit. You can call it drive, you can call it determination, you can call it chutzpah, a Hebrew word that comes up in the book. And the second big thing you need to add to ideas to get innovation is a willingness to take risk. So there's 3 big factors that go into where Israel seemed to get those two things, those two extra ingredients, the grit and the willingness to take risk. And the first is that Israel itself is a startup. This is supposed to illustrate Israel as a startup. Because Israel basically started as an idea, as a very improbable idea, and an idea that took a lot of drive and determination and grit and willingness to take risks to turn into a reality, not just 100 years ago, but continuously. And that's been a huge factor for us. Now, the second is a very interesting and strange factor, and that is the military. Our kids men serve for 3 years, women for 2 years. We have 3 daughters. Our oldest daughter is just turning 18, and she was a little while ago contacted by the Army, said, "Hello, we'd like to get to know you." So it's this rite of passage in Israel. It's a third stage in life. Basically, in most parts of the world, you have 2 stages of life. You have school and you have work. In Israel, there's this third stage of life that's built in. That's the army. And Israelis have been getting things in the army that we don't get in school and in work in many places. Things like leadership, teamwork, sacrifice. I mean, the idea when you're 18 years old that there's something more important than yourself that you have to sacrifice for is a kind of a new idea. But it turns out to be very important for entrepreneurship, because entrepreneurship is very difficult. There's usually an easier way to earn a living than being an entrepreneur. It's risky. It's very difficult. So you have to be motivated, I think, by something more than making money to being an entrepreneur. You have to be motivated by giving back to your society, to your country, to the world. And that's a value that Israelis pick up in the military. And I think another huge one is what I would call mission orientation. Again, this idea of grit, of what a mission is. A mission is something that's very difficult. You have to take risks in order to achieve it. You have to succeed, but on the other hand, you have to take risks. And how do you balance those two things? That's a very difficult skill, and it's the essence of entrepreneurship, and actually in business generally. So Israeli kids go through this experience. Now people talk about 21st century skills, those things that companies are looking for that they can't get in the school system. And we have this paradox with people coming out of college and having difficulty finding work, and companies not being able to find the people they're looking for. This gap, it's called the skills gap. So Israel actually our education system isn't better than the US or Canadian system of dealing with this. But our kids have been picking up these 21st century skills in the Army. Now, I'm not advocating this for anybody. I'm not even, it's one of those don't try this at home type things. We're not even advocating it for Israelis. We wish that someday, we pray for the day we won't have to be in the military so much. But it's been a big factor for us. And the third big one, which actually is very relevant here, is immigration. Immigrants are natural entrepreneurs, and it's really not surprising because they really have these 2 exact ingredients that I talked about. That determination, they were driven enough to move from one place to another. They were willing to take a risk when they did that. And so it's not surprising that entrepreneurs and immigrants are associated with each other everywhere. Something like half the companies in Silicon Valley were started by immigrants. And Israel is a country of immigrants. Almost everybody there moved there themselves like I did, or their parents or their grandparents. So it's a country with an immigrant ethos. And Canada also has a big immigration part of its story, and it's a big asset, I think, to a country that to a region that wants to be innovative. So I want to go now, though, to something that it's not just about startups. To understand Startup Nation, you actually have to understand a relationship between startups and very big companies. This is a very important form of synergy. what's happened with what the lion's share of Startup Nation, what we call Startup Nation, is actually these big companies like Intel, Microsoft, Google, and so on, HP, Johnson Johnson, P&G, all those companies I've been speaking to. I've been coming to Israel looking for innovation, buying companies or investing or building R&D centers. And here's just a few of them. Google just bought Waze, a navigation app that you might use here in Canada, for about $1 billion recently. Facebook bought this compression company called Anavo. Apple bought a company that people haven't heard of, Anabit, but this is actually going to be the beginning of their R&D center in Israel, the first R&D center of Apple outside of the United States. IBM has brought about 10 companies. This is just the latest, that for about $700 million. Trusteer is a cybersecurity company. And Intel actually didn't so much buy companies, but they started an R&D center with just 5 people in the 1970s, a very long time ago. That's now one of Israel's biggest employers, thousands of people. And actually, there's a great story about Intel in the book. And one of the things that was mentioned here was that people in New Brunswick, they like to argue, they like to challenge, to kind of speak their mind, and particularly more than maybe other Canadians. This is something that's very Israeli as well. And we tell a great story in the book about what happened when the Intel, some senior executive from Intel came from the US, and he was at Intel Israel, and he was standing outside a conference room, and suddenly he hears the voices going up, and there's a huge argument, and they all come out red-faced, and he asked, well, what happened? What happened? I mean, is there a problem? I said, no, we just had a great discussion. This is very typical about Israel, and the issue of how you deal with cultural differences is actually a very interesting one we cover in the book. But I want to talk about now what makes countries innovative and some myths about that. There are a lot of governments, I think, that sometimes think that this is what makes countries innovative. This is an example of a tech park. In fact, governments often think of 2 big things when they think of how do we get more startups and stuff. And the first thing is they think of is let's build a tech park. Now, I don't have anything against tech parks. They're great for corporates, but startups really don't necessarily like to be in tech parks. So this won't necessarily produce startups. The next thing that people think about when they want to produce startups is they say, oh, we have to increase our R&D spending, a percentage of GNP. They have to get it up from 1% to 2% or whatever. And that's a great idea, but the problem with that is that Israel is spending 4.5% of its GDP on R&D, but not because the government is so smart. It wasn't a brilliant government policy. It was basically because we have so many startups and R&D centers, we're able to spend that much on R&D. So it's really the startups that drive the spending rather than the other way around. So that's not really the secret either. This is kind of more the secret. Coffee shops. And going back to the tech parks, I mean, where are the startups if they're not in the tech parks? They're in the places you don't necessarily predict. They're not always the nicest part of town. The rents may be cheap, but they're good restaurants, and it's kind of the lively part of town. This is often where the startup's coming up, and this is the important lesson here is that an innovation sector is essentially an organic, bottom-up phenomenon, and that's hard for governments to deal with because governments are top-down, and so it's often a game of how do you just kind of encourage what's happening organically. But I want to get now to the third part, which is how do we kind of work together, and how does that work? there's something essential here we know about when it comes to building our companies, when it comes to building startups. How do we do this? We know the essence is teamwork. We heard a lot about teamwork from our honorees. And that's because it really matters. We only get things done together. And we understand this because we know that there's nobody who's good at everything. And startups, and any of you who invest know this too. Any good investor basically doesn't pay a lot of attention to business plans. Any good investor knows that business plans, they often change very radically. What you're really investing in is the people, is the team. You find a great team as someone's good at tech, someone's good at marketing, someone's good at management, because no one can do all those things together. So that's how we build companies, we build teams. Now, but what we don't do is apply this thinking to countries. Countries are also different. Countries also have different strengths. And why don't we do this with countries? Why don't we combine our strengths? We all think we have to do everything well. And we do this in Israel as well. You know, in Israel, the complaint is, why do we only do startups? Why can't we do big companies? It drives us nuts. And I find this ironic because I've been traveling all over the world, and everywhere I hear, well, why can't we do startups? And they don't even say, why can we only do big companies? They assume that. So everybody's very focused on what they have trouble doing, and they have less ability to see their own strengths. And that's a real problem, because our strengths are what our innovation sector is going to be built on. Now, Chet did something really helpful for me as I was on my way here to New Brunswick. He actually wrote up to try to explain to me the place you're going is kind of some of the strengths of New Brunswick. And in fact, I feel like I should ask this of everywhere I go to go through this exercise, because it's so important. But you know, trust. You know, you don't have to lock your houses. You know, you leave things. I mean, this is a very trusting place. Contracts are sometimes you don't even use contracts. It's all in a handshake. This is the kind of place New Brunswick is. That is an incredibly huge asset that should not be underestimated. There are many places where that does not nearly exist. Resourcefulness is, again, central to entrepreneurship. This is a kind of a place with a pioneering mentality. It's a huge an example. Now, was talked about before that, you know, the problem was the economy was too much focused on resources. But those same resources you can apply innovation to, and that's what you're doing now. I mean, these, you know, the fact that things like paper or wood or fish or whatever can be seen as just a commodity resource, that's one way of looking at it. But you can also turn these things into part of the innovation economy. So these are assets. These are not liabilities. The network, the part that everybody knows everybody. I mean, that's one of the classic things that we write about with Israel, that the social graph, it's not 6 degrees of separation, it's 1 degree of separation. And that's huge. It builds into the trust thing. It builds into the teamwork. It builds into the collaboration. It's a huge asset. Small. The fact that that Canada is a pretty small country in terms of population, and that New Brunswick is really small in terms of population. For Israel, that's been a liability. It's something we've had to overcome, but it's actually been a strength. And it's been a strength because, you know, if you're in China or even France, you're spoiled by your local market or your regional market. You build stuff for that market. First you build for the local market, then you build for the regional market, and only then you think about the global market. Well, we kind of have to all think about the global market. And when you come from a place that doesn't have much of a local market, it forces you to think globally. And that's a strength. That's not a weakness. That's what we've experienced in Israel. Hardiness. I mean, the fact that you guys, like, when I was getting the ride from the airport to here, the driver explained to me, I was asking about the weather, He said, well, we're actually hoping for a slow melt. And I said, what does that mean? Well, if it melts too fast, so the river floods. And we're like, what do you mean the river floods? So, yeah, the hotel you're going to, that's going to be flooded. You know, and he's like, okay, this is life in New Brunswick. And, you know, it's like, this was very familiar. Like, people, for us, it's been the security situation where, you know, we don't live in such a good neighborhood, and we kind of take that for granted. And we're in a tiny country. We don't have any, we're shut off from the regional market, and all these, you know, we've turned adversity into a form of basically a source of creative energy. And so every kind of adversity that you have, it makes you hardier, trains you more to be innovative. You know, so I want to say that the weather is part of your innovative secret. So don't be so down on the weather. So I want to talk a little bit about a new kind of synergy. The first synergy was the synergy between big companies and startups, where big companies, you know, like Intel, all these big companies, what are they doing? They're basically combining what big companies are good at, which is scaling up innovation, and what startups are good at, which is innovation itself. Neither is good at the other. Startups have no idea how to scale. Big companies have a lot of trouble innovating. And together, you know, they've produced a very productive synergy. And a lot of what we call Startup Nation is that. But I'm excited about a new form of synergy that we haven't really tapped into yet. And that's the kind of startup to startup synergy. Why can't we co-innovate? Why can't we actually not just invent stuff in one place and sell it in another, but actually invent it in two places at once? And I think this has tremendous potential. It's only just begun to be possible because for a long time there was only one innovation sector, Silicon Valley. And like 20 years ago or so, Israel came online, and so there's kind of two big innovation sectors. And now there are innovation sectors coming up everywhere. And this has created a whole new opportunity for innovating across countries and cultures, and combining the strengths of different countries. In fact, what I want to say is that, you know, a lot of people look at the Startup Nation story and they say, how can we do it like you? And what I want to say is, don't do it like Israel, do it like New Brunswick, do it like Chile, do it like China or Brazil or Kenya, because every country has its own strengths, its own culture, its own history, its own geography. And that's what's so amazing about the world today, is that while there's a lot in common between the kind of type of person that entrepreneurs are and the kind of skills it takes to be an entrepreneur and all these things, there's a lot in common. Like, people in Silicon Valley feel at home in Israel, and you'll feel at home in Israel. Innovative people, entrepreneurs feel at home in some way in any innovation sector. That's on the one hand. On the other, everyone is different. Every innovation sector is different. Everyone is going to have a certain specialty in one thing, is going to be stronger in one thing or another thing. And so this leads to great opportunity to combine our strength. Like we create teams among people to build company, we can create teams between countries to build companies. So this is Tel Aviv. I live in Jerusalem. The whole country, when you go to mappedinisrael.com, you'll see has startups all over the place. It's a place with tremendous creative energy. And part that we don't so much write about in the book is that same creative energy that's gone into startups has gone into the arts and into culture. The weather's not quite as good as here, but I really do think I really do hope that you do come and visit. It's a direct flight from Toronto. And and I think that when you do, just as I've now gotten excited about New Brunswick and seeing what's going on here, the world-class talent and innovation. I mean, you guys can say you're world-class, but when someone from outside like me or other people see it from an outsider perspective and can see how amazing it is, it's very inspiring. And I think actually that you're completely on the right track. You're actually ahead of a lot of places, because what is the track? The track is, the first stage is you develop a bunch of startups that are kind of under the radar screen. Nobody knows that they're there. In fact, often even in the country itself, people aren't aware that there are startups, and certainly internationally, people are not aware. The next stage, though, is that you get your first success stories, which you've already begun to do. And those success stories have a double effect. They put innovation on the map internally, and basically people start thinking of themselves as, oh, this is a place I might want to be an entrepreneur. I might not want to just go into a big company. It gives a great boost for entrepreneurship, the first few success stories. That's internally. And then externally, it says, you better pay attention, world out there. There's something going on of interest. So those first few success stories are the big hurdle that every aspiring innovation sector has. For us, we went through this in the mid-1990s. The classic story we tell in the book was a company called ICQ, started by a few kids. It was a chat program that suddenly had millions of users. Before there was even barely any internet. The internet was barely around then. There was no Facebook, there was no Twitter. It was really one of the first things to go viral on the internet anywhere. And this startup got bought by AOL for $400 million when it had no revenue. And this led Yossi Vardi, the father of one of the founders and one of the investors, to say, to coin what I think is the motto of the bubble period, of the dot-com bubble, which was, revenue is a distraction. That's not true anymore, so don't listen to that. But that was, that was then. So ICQ got bought for this crazy amount, and suddenly Israelis said, "Oh wow, you know, maybe I could be if these idiots can do it, I can do it." You know, and other people, investors, started looking at Israel and saying, "Wow, there's something going on here." So you're already on that track, and what's great about that is it's self-reinforcing. Once you get those first success stories, they encourage more people to come in, and it's a virtuous cycle. So as a student of this process, I'm telling you that you're on that, you're already in that virtuous cycle, and it's very exciting. It's very exciting to see. And I hope that I would just suggest that you add to this the idea that maybe you can innovate with Israel. And so I hope that some of you come and check out the companies and researchers and scientists and whatever who are doing things very similar to what you're doing. There may be slight different twists that might be useful to combine with. And I hope we can get more Israelis excited about New Brunswick, because it's a two-way process. This is not a one-way thing. This is not about anyone teaching anybody else. It's about us innovating together. And I think that's a great opportunity. So thank you very much. I'm enjoying myself here. And I look forward tomorrow at breakfast. I'll be meeting some of the CEOs of the portfolio companies. And that's one of the most exciting things to me, to meet the innovators in every place. So thank you very much for having me. And I do hope to see you in Israel. Thank you.